The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of the De Soto Hotel hummed with a faint, high-pitched vibration that nobody else seemed to notice, but to me, it sounded exactly like a structural wire under too much tension. I was standing near the back, the smell of damp evening air and expensive gardenia perfume pressing in from the open terrace when Victoria Cross found me. She didn't just walk over. She navigated the crowded room like a frigate cutting through a harbor, her silk gown whispering against the marble floor. Flanked by 3 members of the Savannah Historic Preservation Board, she waited until the mayor finished his toast, until the applause died down and the room fell into that heavy, expectant lull before the orchestra starts up again. And then she spoke loud enough to freeze every champagne glass within 20 feet. She looked at my simple linen jacket, my hands, which still carried the faint trace of limestone dust beneath the nails, and she gave me that terrifyingly polite southern smile that is actually just a knife wrapped in velvet. She said it was a miracle I had the nerve to show my face at a celebration for the city's landmark recovery, when everyone in Chatham County knew my negligence had nearly buried the historic riverfront district in rubble, and that my own husband had been forced to bankrupt his family's firm just to pay for the structural damage I left behind. She said it with a strange, dark sort of hunger in her eyes, a woman delivering a sermon she'd been practicing in front of a mirror for 4 long years, ensuring that every investor, every old money family, and every colleague I had left would hear her call me a hollow fraud. I didn't step back, and I didn't drop my gaze. Because when you spend 15 years studying the way weight distributes across century-old timber and rotting foundation stone, you learn exactly how to find your center of gravity when the ground starts to shake. I looked at the diamond-encrusted Historical Society pin on her lapel, then straight into her eyes, keeping my voice as level as a freshly poured concrete slab. And I asked her if that was truly the narrative she wanted to commit to before the city records were unsealed. Victoria blinked, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her silver clutch, completely unprepared for a woman who refused to flinch or scream in public. Before she could find her tongue to deliver another sharp piece of her mind, the heavy oak double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and a man whose face she hadn't seen in nearly a decade stepped out of the humid Georgia night and into the light. He wasn't supposed to be within 3 states of this ballroom, and he certainly wasn't supposed to be carrying the original ink-stamped geological core samples from the old riverfront warehouse project. In that exact fraction of a second, the carefully built, multi-million-dollar legacy that the Cross family had used to crush. My name was about to meet a structural calculation that couldn't be bribed. Silenced or hidden behind a polite family smile too. Understand why a woman who makes her living restoring the broken foundations of old coastal mansions would stand perfectly still while her former mother-in-law tried to execute her reputation in a ballroom. You have to understand how I was raised. I grew up in a small, salt-scrubbed town on the edge of the Ogeechee River, where my father ran a small boat repair yard and my mother kept the books for the local shrimp cooperative. There were no columns on our porch, no heirloom silver in our cabinets, and no old family names to shield us from the weather. My father used to tell me that a bad weld will always show itself during the first winter storm, no matter how much glossy marine paint you slap over it, and that philosophy became the absolute marrow of my bones. I worked my way through a civil engineering degree by pulling night shifts at a brick kiln, and when I shifted into architectural preservation, I didn't do it because I loved the grand romantic stories of the Old South. I did it because I loved the hidden mechanics of survival, the way ancient heart pine beams could carry the weight of 3 generations if you just treated them with the respect they deserved. I spent my 20s in muddy crawl spaces, measuring the settling patterns of historic brick, learning to listen to the quiet groans of buildings that were trying not to fall down. And I became very good at being the quietest, most precise person in the room. That steady, unblinking focus is what made me an exceptional preservationist. But it was also the exact vulnerability that allowed a charming, hungry man to dismantle my life piece by piece while I was busy looking at the joists. I married Julian Cross when I was 27, back when he still had that bright, breathless enthusiasm that made you feel like you were part of a grand adventure. His family owned Cross and Sons, an old-line Savannah architectural firm that had designed half the public squares in the 19th century but had spent the last 30 years quietly bleeding money and living off the fumes of their ancestors' achievements. Julian was brilliant at selling a vision, at shaking hands with city councilors and convincing wealthy widows to sign over their historic estates for restoration. But he didn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative partition. For the first 5 years of our marriage, we were a perfect, unspoken machine. He would stand in the sunlight at the groundbreaking ceremonies, looking every bit the brilliant, old money savior of the city's history, while I stayed in the trailers until midnight, recalculating wind loads and rewriting the stabilization plans that his draftsman had butchered. We were happy, or at least I told myself we were, until the city announced the restoration of the old foundry complex down on the riverfront, a massive $30 million crown jewel project that would define the firm's survival for the next half-century. The complex sat on a treacherous slope of shifting coastal bluff, built over old ballast stone tunnels that hadn't been mapped since the Civil War. When we pulled the initial core drillings, the results were terrifying. The deep limestone shelves beneath the heavy iron foundry were riddled with hidden water caverns, meaning any significant structural load would cause the entire hillside to slide into the shipping channel. I brought the data to Julian in his oak-paneled office, laying out the graphs that showed we needed to spend an extra $4 million on deep-pressure concrete pilings before we even touched the brickwork. Julian didn't look at the charts. He just laughed, tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, and told me I was being overcautious, that the old engineers knew what they were doing, and that the budget simply couldn't support that kind of underground work. I pushed back hard for 3 weeks, refusing to sign off on the master structural permits. Until one morning, I went to look for the file and found that the engineering certification page had already been stamped and submitted to the city inspector with a signature that looked remarkably like a sloppy version of my own. When I confronted Julian in our kitchen that night, his entire demeanor changed from the sweet, supportive husband to a cold, distant stranger whose voice sounded like dry winter grass. He told me that Crossmen had built this city while my family was still digging clams out of the mud, and that he wasn't going to let a paranoid girl from the swamps ruin the biggest contract his family had seen in a generation. He told me to keep my head down, do the cosmetic brick restoration, and let the real business of construction be handled by people who understood how the world actually worked. I should have gone straight to the city building department the next morning, but I was trapped in that terrible, quiet maze of loyalty and self-doubt that keeps good women silent when they should be screaming fire. I trusted that maybe he had consulted an outside consultant, that maybe I was being too rigid, and that the marriage was worth more than a dispute over foundation pilings. That silence was the first major fracture in my own foundation. And I didn't realize until it was too late that once you let a dishonest man break your integrity, he will use the pieces to build a wall to bury you behind. Victoria Cross didn't just support her son's sudden coldness. She weaponized it with the kind of calculated social grace that can only be cultivated over 40 years of hosting charity luncheons on Jones Street. Her late husband had left her with a grand historic townhouse, a mountain of social prestige, and a son who was supposed to be the living proof that the Cross bloodline was still elite. When she realized that I was refusing to play the part of the grateful, quiet wife who stayed in the background and validated her son's genius, she began a subtle, devastating whispering campaign through her garden clubs and historical preservation committees. It started with small, pitting remarks over tea about how sad it was that I lacked the social stamina for the family's position, and how my background in rough construction work made it difficult for me to appreciate the finer nuances of historic design. Then, when the first small cracks began to appear in the retaining walls of the foundry project 3 months into construction, she shifted the narrative completely, telling anyone who would listen that my stubborn, old-fashioned engineering methods were delaying the project and costing the family firm millions in penalties. I would show up at site meetings to find that the foreman had been instructed by Julian to ignore my memos. And when I tried to speak to the city inspectors, they treated me with a patronizing, gentle condescension that made my blood run cold. They had already been told by Julian and his mother that I was going through a difficult emotional period, that the stress of the project was making me unstable, and that my technical objections were just the hysterical reactions of a woman who was overwhelmed by the scale of real architectural work. I stood in my boots on that muddy riverfront site, surrounded by men who looked right through me, and I realized that a lie doesn't have to be clever to destroy you. It just has to be repeated by people with enough social capital to buy the silence of everyone else in the room. I went home and sat in the dark of our house, listening to the heavy coastal rain hit the tin roof, feeling the slow, sickening realization that the man I slept next to was actively constructing a cage for my career, and his mother was already tightening the bolts. The collapse didn't happen during a dramatic storm. It happened on a clear, hot Tuesday afternoon in July, when the air was so thick you could taste the salt from the Atlantic. I was 3 miles away, working on the timber framing of an old bakery on Broughton Street, when I felt the low, thudding vibration through the soles of my boots before I ever heard the sirens. The western retaining wall of the old foundry complex had blown out from the bottom, the massive weight of the unreinforced brickwork sliding 60 feet down the bluff, pulling 2 cranes and the entire historic ironwork terrace into the mud of the Savannah River. It was a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar failure that made the national news within an hour. And before the dust had even settled over the riverfront, the machinery to blame me was already turning at full speed. I drove down to the site, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to be blocked at the security gate by 2 sheriffs, deputies who told me they had strict orders from the firm's ownership to keep me off the property for my own safety and the integrity of the investigation. When I finally got into our house that evening, Julian's closet was completely bare, the hangers still swinging in the empty air. In a thick blue folder from a high-priced corporate defense firm was sitting on the center of our butcher block kitchen island. He hadn't just left. He had legally separated our personal assets, resigned from the partnership we had built together, and issued a press release through his mother's public relations circle stating that the structural failure was the direct result of flawed engineering calculations performed exclusively by Joanna Vance. By the time the weekend arrived, the story had become absolute gospel among the city's elite. Julian was the tragic, noble architect whose historic family business had been brought to its knees by the reckless incompetence of his swamp-born wife, a girl they had foolishly trusted with their legacy. Victoria Cross made sure that every charitable board, every historic church vestry, and every local newspaper reporter knew that her poor son was working 20 hours a day to clear the wreckage I had caused, while I was left with a shattered reputation and a pile of legal threats that carried enough financial weight to bury me for the rest of my natural life. If you have ever had to walk into the local grocery store while the people you've known for a decade suddenly find something intensely interesting to look at on the bottom shelf just to avoid meeting your eyes, Then, the specific, oily taste of public exile. It is a quiet, freezing kind of isolation that makes you doubt your own memory, your own skills, and your own right to occupy a room. I didn't fight back in the papers, and I didn't hire a publicist to scream my innocence from the rooftops, because I was still operating under the old, broken belief that if you just keep your head down and do good work, the truth will eventually clear the weeds away on its own. I took a job as a basic field estimator for a small timber salvage yard out in Effingham County, a place where nobody cared about historic preservation or old family names. Spending my days measuring salvaged heart pine logs and checking old barns for termite damage. It was brutal, hot, dusty work that paid less in a month than Julian spent on his tailored linen suits in a week. But the smell of fresh sawdust and the clean, uncomplicated geometry of raw timber became the only things that kept my mind from fracturing entirely under the weight of what had been done to me. But a lie that big doesn't just stay in its box. It has a way of growing roots and reaching into the one corner of your life you thought you had protected from the rot. 2 years after the River Bluffs collapsed, the State Licensing Board for Professional Engineers received an anonymous 40-page complaint detailing my alleged gross negligence on the foundry project, complete with copies of the forged structural permits that carried my altered signature. The board launched a formal investigation into my professional standing, a process that meant I was facing the permanent revocation of my engineering license, the absolute death of the name I had spent my entire adult life building with my own sweat. When I received the certified letter from the board, I sat on the porch of the small, rented river cottage I had moved into after the divorce, watching the black water of the tidal creek move through the marsh grass, and I realized that my dignified silence hadn't been a virtue at all. It had been an invitation for them to finish the job, a green light for Julian and Victoria to permanently erase my ability to ever work as an equal in the only field I loved. Because as long as I was still breathing and licensed, I was a living threat to the story they needed to tell the world. The next morning, I didn't drive to the timber yard. Instead, I followed a recommendation from an old bridge foreman I trusted and walked up the narrow, creaking stairs of a brick building near the customs house to the office of a lawyer named Clara Finch. Clara didn't have an office that looked like Julian's. There were no oil paintings of sailing ships on her walls, no silver trays for bourbon, just towering stacks of zoning files, old property deeds, and a pair of reading glasses tied to her neck with a piece of heavy-duty fishing line. She listened to me for 2 solid hours without shifting her weight, her pen scratching against a yellow legal pad, her eyes steady and sharp behind her thick lenses. When I finally ran out of breath, she laid her palms flat on the desk, looked at me with the kind of absolute clarity that feels like a cold breeze on a humid August afternoon, and told me that what I was dealing with wasn't just a bitter divorce or a bad family dynamic. She said it was a coordinated corporate fraud designed to use my clean professional record as an insurance shield for Julian's financial malfeasance, and that the only way to stop a bully with an old name was to force them to defend their story under the strict, unyielding lights of a federal discovery motion. She laid it out for me with the cold, beautiful logic of a master builder blueprinting a retaining wall, showing me that to win my life back, we had to prove that Julian had actively forged the engineering certifications, that Victoria had intentionally used her nonprofit preservation boards to damage my business relationships, and that the firm had suffered from systemic financial irregularities long before the first shovel ever touched the riverfront mud. I felt a great, cold knot of terror form in my throat because it meant opening up every wound, every personal failure, and every quiet humiliation to the public record, allowing the entire city to watch us dig through the garbage of my failed marriage. Clara looked at me over her glasses, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that sounded like a church bell across water. And she told me that peace is a wonderful thing to keep. But you can't keep peace with a predator who is currently using your silence to build a monument to his own theft. She said we were going to file a multi-million-dollar tortious interference and fraud suit against both Julian and the Cross Family Trust. Not because we wanted their money, but because the rules of civil procedure would force them to produce the one thing they had spent for years hiding. The original project ledgers and the internal construction logs. It took 4 weeks of intense midnight work to draft the complaint, organizing every text message, every ignored structural memo, and every piece of altered documentation into a sequence of numbered paragraphs that felt like a series of small, heavy stones being dropped into a calm pond. When the process server finally delivered the papers to Julian at his new office on Bratton Street, the reaction from the Cross family was instantaneous and furious, like a hornet's nest that had been struck by a logging chain. Victoria went on the offensive immediately, calling an emergency meeting of the Historical Society to declare that I had become a vindictive, unhinged woman whose jealousy over her son's continued professional success had driven me to launch a frivolous, spiteful assault on their family's good name. Julian's high-priced lawyers filed a massive 70-page motion to dismiss, arguing that the entire suit was an abuse of the legal system, an emotional reaction to a standard marital dissolution, and that my claims of forgery were nothing more than the desperate fabrications of a disgraced engineer trying to shift the blame for her own professional failure. Clara called me into her office on a rainy Friday afternoon to show me their formal response, her finger tracing down the legal jargon until she reached their core defense strategy, which was beautifully, dangerously simple. Julian's attorneys had staked their entire case on the absolute assertion of truth as a defense, swearing under penalty of perjury that every document submitted to the city had been reviewed and approved by me, and that Julian's personal design work on the new riverfront promenade project, massive new development he was currently building on the same bluff, proved his structural methods were flawless. Clara looked up at me, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face that made her look 20 years younger. And she said they had just walked straight into the exact trap she had been blueprinting since our very first meeting. She explained that by asserting his personal design work on the new project was a proof of his technical competence and that the old failure was entirely my fault. Julian had legally opened the door for us to demand the complete, unredacted engineering files and structural plans for both the old failure and the current, multi-million-dollar development he was parading before the city. That night, I sat on the small dock behind my cottage, the salt air heavy with the scent of pluff mud and marsh rosemary, and I started putting together a timeline in my head that had been bothering me for years like a loose tooth. I remembered a specific week 3 years ago, right before our marriage completely fell apart, when Julian had spent 4 days locked in the private archives of the old Chatham County Surveyor's Office, a place where the city kept the original, handwritten architectural drawings and foundation logs of every building, erected before the Great Fire of 1889. He had come home later each night with a strange, frantic energy, his skin smelling of old sheepskin vellum and dry rot, drinking twice as much scotch as usual and staring at the ceiling for hours without speaking a word to me. The next morning, he had suddenly announced that he had single-handedly solved the design problem for the new riverfront promenade, producing a set of incredibly complex, masterfully executed structural blueprints for a floating foundation system that would allow construction on the shifting river bluffs without the expensive concrete pilings I had demanded. I hadn't questioned it then because I was too exhausted, too beaten down by his mother's cruelty, and too desperate to believe that my husband was the brilliant man he claimed to be. But now, with Clara's words ringing in my ears, That frantic week in the archives looked less like an artistic breakthrough and more like a desperate act of historical plagiarism. The next morning, I went back to that old surveyor's archive myself, spending 6 hours in the dusty basement under the watchful eye of a clerk who had known my father, digging through the uncatalogued personal boxes of Arthur Van's no relation to me. Just an old 19th century master mason who had built the original riverfront retaining walls after the Civil War. There, tucked inside a moldering leather logbook wrapped in oiled canvas, I found the original, hand-inked cross-sections of the entire riverfront bluff, detailing a hidden, subterranean drainage system that the old builders had used to keep the hillside stable. And there, written in a clear, flowing copperplate script, was an explicit warning that any construction that blocked those ancient limestone outlets would cause the entire hillside to liquefy and slide into the river within 5 years. I looked at the old drawings, then looked at the glossy promotional brochures for Julian's new riverfront promenade development, and a cold, terrible understanding settled into my chest like a block of ice. Julian hadn't designed a revolutionary floating foundation at all. He had simply copied Arthur Vance's old drawings, altered the dates, and presented them to the city council as his own original modern engineering breakthrough, completely ignoring the fact that he had sealed the very drainage outlets that kept the entire bluff from collapsing. Clara moved with the speed and precision of an ironworker, setting a major girder, filing a formal motion to compel the immediate production of Julian's private project logs and the original engineering drafts for the new promenade development. Julian's legal team fought the motion with a desperate, white-knuckled ferocity that told us we had laid our hands directly on the hidden nerve of their entire deception. They argued corporate secrecy, trade secrets, intellectual property protection, and personal privacy, doing everything short of burning the files to keep them out of our hands. The judge, a sharp, known-sense woman from South Georgia who had spent 30 years watching old money, families try to use their names to bypass the building codes, held a 3-hour hearing on the motion while I sat at the plaintiff's table, my grandmother's thin silver ring cool against my finger. Watching Julian's hands shake as his lawyer scrambled for excuses, the judge didn't just grant our motion. She issued a strict 24-hour order for the physical production of the master design journals, stating that when a developer stakes his defense on his personal architectural genius, he cannot use a corporate shield to hide the drafts from the woman he accused of competence. When the blue boxes of discovered documents arrived at Clara's office the following week, we didn't find a sophisticated modern engineering study. We found a crime scene, written in Julian's own handwriting. Tucked between the pages of his daily project journals were the original, carbon-copied receipts from a private soil testing laboratory in Atlanta from 4 years ago, showing that Julian had received a definitive report stating the foundry bluff was unstable 3 weeks before he forged my signature on the permit application. He had known the ground was failing before the first brick was laid. He had siphoned the $4 million intended for the safety pilings into a private offshore account to pay off his mother's historic estate debts. And he had intentionally used my name as the engineering scapegoat because he knew my quiet, non-confrontational nature would make me the perfect victim to take the fall for the insurance fraud. But the most devastating piece of paper in that box was a printout of a text message exchange from the night of the collapse, sent from Julian to his mother, Victoria, that read, "The wall went down just like we figured. Everything is underwater. Make sure the historic board knows Joanna was the lead designer, so the insurance payout comes straight to the family trust." I stood in the center of Clara's office, the humid afternoon sun cutting through the dusty blinds, holding that piece of paper while the entire 4-year nightmare of my exile dissolved into a fierce, blindingly clear sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with justice. The relief didn't make me want to cry. It made me feel solid, like an old oak tree whose roots had finally hit the bedrock after years of shifting sand. Knowing that I was completely, undeniably whole. But as I stared at the timeline in the journal, a second, far more dangerous realization began to take shape in my mind. Julian hadn't just used those stolen 19th century drawings to clear his name in the past. He was using them right now to build the new riverfront promenade. And according to the construction schedule we had just recovered, his crews had finished sealing the main ancient limestone drainage outlets. Underneath the new hotel site less than 48 hours ago, the entire new development, a $60 million project packed with hundreds of workers and future tourists, was currently sitting on a structural fuse that was actively burning down toward a second, catastrophic slide that would dwarf the first failure. I didn't launch a frantic media campaign, and I didn't go screaming to the local news stations, because I knew that Julian and Victoria still held enough influence with the local editors to bury the story as an emotional attack from an ex-wife until after the grand opening gala. Instead, Clara and I took the complete forensic engineering file, the forged permits, the hidden lab reports, and the stolen Vance drawings straight to the regional director of the Federal Building Safety Administration and the State Attorney General's office. Bypassing the local county inspector network entirely, we spent 3 days in a windowless federal conference room in Atlanta, laying out the data side by side with the original geological core samples that Julian had hidden in his mother's basement, archive samples we had recovered through a federal marshal's search warrant. That very morning, the federal engineers didn't laugh and they didn't treat me with patronizing condescension. They looked at my structural calculations, looked at the chemical breakdown of the liquefying soil layers, and their faces went completely white as they realized they were looking at a major urban disaster, waiting for the next high tide. That brings me back to the grand ballroom of the DeSoto Hotel on that bright, cold evening in late October, with Victoria Cross pointing a diamond-ringed finger at my chest and telling the cream of Savannah society that I was a disgraced fraud who shouldn't be allowed to breathe the same air as her brilliant son. She stood there in her silk gown, her chin tilted at that arrogant, untouchable angle, completely unaware that the man who had just walked through the back double doors with a federal marshal and a stack of emergency junction papers was Arthur Reyes, the former senior partner of Cross & Sons, whom her husband had forced out of the city 20 years ago for asking too many questions about their financial accounts. Arthur didn't look at the festive ice sculptures or the sparkling champagne towers. He walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, his heavy boots echoing on the marble floor, and handed a certified copy of a federal structural condemnation order and a felony arrest warrant directly to Julian, who was standing near the mayor's podium with a glass of vintage port in his hand. The music didn't just stop. It fractured into a chaotic, terrifying silence as the federal marshals stepped forward and instructed the hotel staff to immediately evacuate the entire riverfront promenade district, including the grand ballroom we were standing in. Due to an imminent structural hazard to public safety, Victoria's face drained of color so fast she looked like an old plaster bust that had been left out in the rain. Her hand shaking so hard, her silver clutch clattered against the floor, spilling her cards and her expensive lipstick across the polished stone. She turned on me then, her high society composure completely disintegrating into a raw, ugly screech, pointing her finger at my face and screaming that I had ruined her family, that I had twisted the documents, and that a girl from the swamps was never built to understand the legacy of a grand house like theirs. She cried out the exact same line she had used against me at church suppers and charity luncheons for 4 long years, her voice cracking across the silent, terrified room. Some people just aren't built for the grand design. Joanna, you're just a destructive, bitter girl who couldn't keep her husband's love. I stood perfectly still in my linen jacket, my pulse steady, my hands completely calm by my sides, looking at the woman who had used for years of my life as a footstool for her son's vanity. And I kept my voice clear and level enough to carry to the very back of the mezzanine. I told her she was exactly right, that some people were never built for the grand design, but that the structural failure in this room wasn't mine. It was sitting 6 feet away in a tailored suit that was currently being handcuffed by a federal officer. I looked Julian dead in the eye as the marshals let him pass, the high society investors who had trusted him with their life savings, watching his eyes drop to the floor. A broken, hollow man who had spent his entire life wearing his family's name like a costume, until the actual weight of the truth finally brought the house down around his ears. The churchwomen from Victoria's Circle, the ones who had spent years nodding along to her pitying stories about my instability, sat there in their evening gowns with their mouths open. The reality of the massive financial and social fraud finally settling over them like a thick layer of river fog. The aftermath of that night wasn't a sudden, noisy explosion. It was the slow, inevitable grinding of the gears of justice, taking back the ground that had been stolen by a lie. Julian's legal team collapsed within a week, faced with the undeniable weight of the federal forensic engineering reports and the offshore financial ledgers we had forced into the light of day. He took a plea bargain to federal insurance fraud, forgery, and reckless endangerment, receiving an 8-year sentence in a federal facility out west, away from the coastal city where his name had once been a passport to absolute immunity. The Cross Family Trust was completely dismantled to pay for the massive emergency stabilization work required to keep the riverfront bluff from sliding into the shipping channel, forcing Victoria to sell her grand historic townhouse on Jones Street to an out-of-state preservation group that turned it into a public museum. I heard she moved into a small, rented apartment out near the highway, completely dropped by the garden clubs and historical societies she had ruled like a general for 30 years. A woman who had chosen to live inside a beautiful lie until the foundation simply vanished. Beneath her feet, the state engineering board didn't just dismiss the anonymous complaint against me. They issued a formal public letter of commendation to my office, noting that my independent structural calculations had prevented a multi-million-dollar disaster that would have cost dozens of lives on the Savannah riverfront. 3 months after the ballroom collapsed, the city council voted unanimously to appoint Vance Preservation Services as the lead engineering consultant for the permanent stabilization and restoration of the entire historic riverfront district, giving me back the exact project that had been used to destroy my name. Built this time on my own terms and with my own crew. My first morning back on the site, I stood in my muddy boots at the edge of the bluff, breathing in the sharp, clean smell of river salt and wet limestone dust, looking down at the massive concrete pilings that were finally being driven deep into the bedrock where they belonged. I pulled my father's old brass pocket rule from my jacket, checking the alignment of the first major structural tie, and I realized that the heavy, crushing tiredness that had lived in my shoulders for 4 long years had completely evaporated into the morning air. I wasn't hiding in the shadows of a timber yard anymore, and I wasn't carrying a bag of stones that belonged to a dishonest man and his arrogant mother. I was standing in the bright Georgia sunlight, running my own firm, completely steady on my own 2 feet. I never wrote Julian a letter, and I never went to see him at the facility, because I didn't need an apology from a man who didn't know how to tell the truth to his own reflection in the mirror. I just kept the work, kept the small river cottage, and kept the quiet, unshakable knowledge that a good foundation doesn't need a grand name or a polite smile to survive the weather. It just needs to be built true from the very first stone. If you are standing in the dark right now, listening to the people you loved write a story about you that isn't true, let my voice be the structural report you need to hear tonight. Do not scream, do not bend, and do not let them use your silence as a shield for their own rot. Just dig down to the bedrock. Tell your truth where the record cannot be altered, and let the weight of their own lies do the rest of the work for you.